Hello and welcome to the May 2024 ENSO seminar. This month we will hear from Alejandra Martinez Quintero, who is based in San Sebastian at the University of the Basque Country. Alejandra works in the IAS research group and has also collaborated to create the project of Forgotten Female Bodies, which is a research group at the same university. It's been working there since 2017. She's visited the Institute for Research in Applied Mathematics, the National Autonomous University of Mexico with Tom Froese. That was in 2018 to 19. And Alejandra is interested in the philosophical and historical problems about the female body in topics such as pregnancy, breastfeeding, and the menstrual cycle. So you are very welcome, Alejandra, to present the seminar today.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. It's an honor. And thanks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we're delighted to have you. So as is our kind of normal courses of affairs, we'll kick off the whole thing with a commercial break. So there's just a little bit of news that I'll share first, which has, hang on a second, I'll just share a screen here. It's just to announce a conference that might be of interest to the NCO audience here. So there's a conference in Spelman College. The conference itself is happening in October, but the deadline for submissions is the 1st of July. So the conference is Marginalized Body Epistemologies and 4E Embodied Cognition. So there's sort of quite an exciting lineup there. And I think just a superb and fascinating topic, and one certainly that I think will be of interest to the ENSO audience. So you can, I'm not quite sure if the URL is easily visible there, but it's women4e.com or women-4e.com. Both of them work. So that's the number 4, women4e.com or women-4e.com. So that is one. They have hybrid options as well. So they will be sort of conference both in person and via remote connections. So it's something certainly to look forward to, I think, at the very least in participating, and even if we don't all get to present. But I think there's certainly a lot to be looking forward to in that one. So that's great. That's my bit, Alejandra. So I think you also have a recommendation for us as well, but I think you have it on a slide, so we can probably start the slideshow there, and we will look into that.
Okay, I'm sharing the screen, I think.
Yeah, that looks like it's coming through nice and clear. Perfect.
Next
So
slide.
I invite you to give your recommendation, and then we'll follow through directly with the May 2024 seminar. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm a first-time parent, so I've been recently reading this book, Good Inside by Becky Kennedy. So I think it's an interesting book because Becky Kennedy is a clinical psychologist, but she was trained in behaviorist approaches to fix bad behavior in children. So during her clinical practice, she realized that these behavioral approaches didn't feel good or right to her. So she developed her own approach based on a more compassionate view of both child and parent. And also it's kind of based on psychoanalysis and family systems theory. But to me, the main takeaway from an enactive point of view is that she suggests that children learn to regulate their emotions through the way the parent embodies the emotion of the child. What I mean with this is that it depends on the way the parent reacts to the child's emotion, how the child will integrate that emotion or that experience. So I don't know, it sounds to me quite enactive and participatory, this approach to parenthood. And it's not a theoretical book, it's a guide, a practical guide, but I think it's very well like researched and very well argued, and it challenges many assumptions on child development. So that's my recommendation. And now my talk, I will go straight forward. So this talk, it's one of the chapters of my PhD thesis. So I would like to introduce a little bit the context of why I'm looking for autonomy in the menstrual cycle. Basically, my PhD thesis, it's about how the menstrual cycle affects cognition. So in looking for this relationship or new ways to study this relationship, I began first by looking at how the menstrual cycle was researched in cognitive science. So the first thing I noticed was that cognitive science focused a lot on assessing cognitive performance or evaluating emotion processing, how emotion processing changes across the menstrual cycle. Another interesting thing that I found was that evolutionary psychology used a lot the menstrual cycle as evidence to argue for psychosocial adaptations for women to have more reproductive success. So they argue some changes in social behavior or in emotion recognition in others. And of course, it's a lot of literature on psychiatry, the well-known premenstrual syndrome or premenstrual dysphoric disorder. But it's also a new concept that I think it's interesting, that is that the premenstrual phase might be a vulnerability window for mental disorders. So that's also like quite interesting nowadays to in this kind of research. So in assessing cognitive performance, one of the common tests to evaluate cognitive abilities like visual-spatial ability or working memory is the mental rotation task. So this test is widely used to assess cognitive performance, as many of you, I'm sure you know, because working memory has been correlated with reasoning skills, high reasoning skills like reading comprehension or mathematical problem solving or decision making. So the dominant hypothesis in relation to the menstrual cycle is that cognitive performance across the menstrual cycle varies according to the levels, hormonal levels of any particular phase. So they suggest that, for instance, the first phase of the menstrual cycle, it's follicular phase, where hormonal levels are supposed to be at their lowest levels. So they suggest that this is a more masculine phase in terms of that they expect that skills like visual-spatial ability or math are improved during menstruation, though this might look like a hidden assumption that the brain becomes temporarily more masculine due to lack of female hormones. This is kind of the base of the hypothesis. Then they suggest that in pre-ovulatory phase or late follicular phase, high levels of estrogen, a little bit in contradiction with previous claim, must enhance the accuracy of working memory and also attention. So productivity may be increased as well at ovulation. And finally, this hypothesis also suggests that in the luteal phase, maybe feminine skills are improved as the female hormones, or so-called female hormones, are at their highest, in particular progesterone. So cognitive tasks such as verbal skills, verbal memory, perceptual speed, and fine motor skills should be improved. In the field of evolutionary psychology, one of the leading hypotheses is the ovulatory shift hypothesis. And evolutionary psychology used this to explain how the menstrual cycle affects social behavior and decision-making in women's phases. So this hypothesis suggests that the hormonal changes give an evolutionary advantage to women for reproductive success, meaning that women prefer masculine phases in the fertile phase. So they look for more symmetric phases, like the picture of the right. While in the non-fertile phases, they look for a more feminine phase. They argue this is because in low conception risk phases, like the luteal phase, women tend to look for more long-term relationships, as the reproductive strategy is to find a good parent, in contrast to only good genes. Also, another of the hypotheses of evolutionary psychology, but more related to the luteal phase, is that high levels of progesterone that are characteristic of pregnancy can provide also the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle with psychosocial adaptations, like looking for prosocial behavior, or recruiting social allies, or avoiding disease and risk behavior, and over-perceiving negative emotions in others, so they can decide what to do to reestablish the connection or to avoid any possible threat. Of course, one of the concerns in this kind of research is the gender bias that seems to be there. So many of these hypotheses have a gender bias in the sense that either in the design of the test or in the very research questions that motivates the hypothesis, there are many gender assumptions that should be revised. For instance, the assumption that men are better at math or at navigating space, something that should be biased, as some standardized tests are shown to favor men, and this is proved because in there are some studies that try to measure the same skill but in different terms, like open-ended questions or essays, or in class grades, like in math classes, and women tend to outperform men in the same skills. So also in the idea that women are better at socializing, that's something highly contextual and cultural, and at least cannot be assumed to be dependent on sex variable. And of course, this idea that the traits of the face can show an objective measure of masculinity, it's a little at dispute nowadays. Another problem is the validity of some of the tools used to measure this kind of cognitive skills in the case of measuring cognitive performance. For instance, Bennett and Hacker have convincingly argued that though mental rotation claims to measure visuospatial skills and working memory, it might only measure the skill to rotate an object in our imagination. So the assumption that the mental rotation measures visuospatial skills is basically based upon the idea that we manipulate representations of the world in our heads But this assumption, as I think an activist or an active theory have shown, it's very largely criticized, and yeah, we should be wary of this kind of claims. Third, it seems that it's not that clear whether these studies are looking for the relevant correlations, as there is no real consistency in the evidence to associate cognitive performance with any particular hormonal level. And what seems to be a little bit more salient, at least in what women reports in reporting experience, are the emotional related changes. However, when studying these emotional related changes, it's also a concern that, at least to me, that most of the research focus on the negative effects, and I think they are overlooking other possible positive effects that the menstrual cycle might have in affective experience. For instance, in psychiatry, the focus, as I mentioned previously, has been mostly the premenstrual phase. And traditionally, there has been a long controversy about the pathologization of the menstrual cycle or the premenstrual phase by putting a diagnosis in premenstrual syndrome. Now, this idea has been kind of substituted by the idea of window of vulnerability, where the symptoms may not show a disorder per se, but might increase the deterioration of underlying mental disorders like depression or anxiety or psychosis or addictive behaviors. It can be the symptoms of these mental disorders can be worsened by the menstrual phase. So, besides these concerns, more specific of cognitive science, there are also some other concerns that are common to the study of the menstrual cycle in general. And that's the role of steroid hormones in effects in general in the body or in cognition. So measuring levels of steroid hormones in a particular phase is very complicated. Just to clarify, at the beginning I was talking about female hormones, and now I talk about steroid hormones because I think the label female hormones is quite of gender bias, and steroid hormone address more broadly all these effects that are beyond reproduction and beyond the female body, as estrogens and progesterone can be found also in males. So just to clarify. So what I was saying, it's very complicated to establish the hormonal level of a typical phase of the cycle. This is because absolute levels vary greatly, not only among individuals, but even between cycles in the same individual. And that's why we hear here and there that it's very tricky to talk about normal steroid hormonal levels across the menstrual cycle. Another problem is that, as I mentioned, that steroid hormones have multiple effects. They are involved in multiple biological processes, from gene expression to development and cell differentiation. For instance, it contributes to regulate metabolism, cellular osmosis, development in the musculoskeletal system. They also participate in cardiovascular functioning, modulating neurotransmitters. It's very complex the way they participate in many biological processes. Another concern is that steroid hormones have multiple and overlapping timescales, some immediate and some delay. So to illustrate a little bit this issue of the timescales, I want to show you the mode of action of the receptors that can be bound by steroids. Estrogens and progesterone not only act in the hypothalamus and pituitary to regulate reproduction, they also diffuse freely, as they are low-weight molecules, into the brain, into different brain areas to bind different kinds of receptors. For instance, there is the classic estrogen receptor. It can be the progesterone receptor, which is in the nucleus, and which its action, it's commonly to activate gene expression to produce a particular kind of protein. And their effects are known to act within a time delay of hours to days, in contrast to other kind of receptors like membrane receptors. And one example is the GABA receptors. GABA, or gamma aminobutyric acid, or we say GABA for short, is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. So GABA prevents neural excitation, and it is well known to induce sedative states, sleepiness, reduce stress, prevent seizures. So by binding these receptors, steroid hormones have rapid, in contrast to the nuclear receptor, rapid non-genomic effects that can alter neural activity in some brain regions. So for instance, neurosteroids like allopregnanolone, which is the main metabolite of progesterone, can act as allosteric modulator, just as barbiturates or other molecules like alcohol or benzodiazepines. And this means that the fluctuating levels of steroids across the menstrual cycle might facilitate or even activate the mechanism of this receptor. This is increasing the permeability of the neurons, hyperpolarizing the postsynaptic neuron, and inhibiting a particular brain region, and possibly inducing the above-mentioned effects like anxiolytic, hypnotic, sedative, anticonvulsant effects. And these two effects obviously can be overlapped. Finally, a fourth concern about measuring hormones is that the ratio between estrogen and progesterone matters a lot. This is because different ratios are believed to have opposite effects. So this is a very common thing that happens, for instance, in the luteal phase, which is the second, in common terms, it's the premenstrual phase, in which progesterone normally or theoretically should be higher at least than estrogens, but it can happen that estrogen is higher than progesterone or at the same level. So these inversions in ratios are relevant because they can provide a different experience for the person, and it's quite normal between different cycles. Okay, so facing and acknowledging all these challenges, what can the enactive view, I ask myself, can offer to the complexity of the topic? Well, let's begin by reviewing a little bit the strengths of the enactive theory. First, the gender bias, it's commonly linked or based to an idea of the body as universal, as well as the mind. And this makes us think that we are studying a neutral, objective, scientific body, but in fact, what we are studying is the male reference. That's called the generic male, right? So by using an embodied approach, the enactive theory helps to take this concreteness of different bodies and, of course, their experience as necessary to understand the meaningful aspects of cognitive phenomena. So basically, I think that by studying the concreteness of different bodies, the universal mind is challenged. So I think the enactive theory is like quite suitable for that. Then for the issues of validity, of course, they are based on representational and computational assumptions. So as the enactive theory is non-representational, this is not really an issue in the enactive theory, as they look at cognition as an enaction of the agent and the world through meaningful interactions, and not as an internal manipulation of representations or information. And finally, about the complexity of hormonal dynamics, I think many of the problems in trying to capture the causal effect of a hormonal level is because we are trying to stay in the reductionist and deterministic way of naturalizing phenomena. And the way enactive theory approaches this, I think it's very promising in this field because it addresses all these complex phenomena as interactive and as interactive wholes. So by taking an approach of systems biology and dynamical systems theory tools, I think we can start viewing hormonal variation not as a correlation between a level and particular effect in a particular cognitive task, but as a dynamic pattern that emerged from an interacting whole. So if we start looking at the menstrual cycle as a dynamic whole, it raised to me the question, is it possible to say that the menstrual cycle is an autonomous system? Like, maybe it's useful, it's possible? What do we need to say that it's autonomous? So in the enactive tradition that follows Varela, Thompson, Di Paolo, the definition of autonomy has been expanded and corrected, as in the beginning was mainly definition of closure as autopoiesis, and then it evolved to a more technical definition as autonomy as operational closure under precarious conditions. I will not go into much detail in these definitions, so don't make it longer, as I assume most of us are familiarized with these theories. So, on the other hand, what do we need to see in the menstrual cycle to find this operational closure? And for that, I think it's important to define the menstrual cycle, because not all mammals menstruate. And I think it's relevant to make this distinction, at least from a biological point of view, though maybe this is not necessarily the case for clinical criteria. For instance, for women that with anovulatory cycles, or amenorrhea, or that take contraceptives. So the definition, at least in biological terms, is that the species that menstruate have a bleeding that should be a physiological response that may meet two criteria. The bleeding is a reaction of a progesterone withdrawal, and this progesterone withdrawal has to happen to a previously decidualized endometrium. Decidualize or decidualization means that the endometrium gets thickened, but not only that, it's a cascade of events that happen in the endometrium that turns normal stromal cells of the endometrium into decidual cells. So the cell types of the endometrium change and transform, so to speak, into a new cell that this kind of cells make the endometrium a endocrine organ, able to prepare for pregnancy and implantation. So it's a very huge thing, decidualization. Anyway, so these conditions should be cyclically met in species that spontaneously ovulate and spontaneously decidualize. Sorry. So I will explain a little bit the difference between induced decidualization and induced ovulation and spontaneous ovulation and decidualization. So in some species, ovulation is induced externally. For instance, it can be induced by a partner by copulation, and something similar happens to the decidualization, which is externally induced by the signal of an embryo, meaning that an ovum or an egg should have been fertilized. So when it arrives to the endometrium, it signals the endometrium, hey, I need to be implanted. So the endometrium starts changing to receive this embryo and to establish pregnancy. However, okay, this is induced. In the spontaneous ovulation, the signal of the copulation, it's endogenous, it's internalized. It's taken over by the ovary. So the ovary, it has their own signal that it's estrogen to trigger the pituitary to have the LHP. That's the technical mechanism. So the full process can be performed without without external conditions, whether or not the individual copulates. And something similar happens in spontaneous decidualization, which is no longer needed to have an embryo, the presence of the embryo in the endometrium, for the endometrium to decidualize. And this is very well explained by Mihaela's Pavlichev lab and Gunther Wagner lab. They provide me a lot of insight on this by their work on the evolution of female reproduction, and in particular, the evolution of ovulation. It's believed to evolve from the environmental signal to the partner-induced trigger signal into the ovarian estrogenic signal, and they term this process kind of autonomization, as they don't depend anymore on external conditions. So to see this in terms of operational closure, I like to put it in a more graphical way, which we can see that the gray circles are external of the closure. And when the estrogen signal takes over the triggering process, then the process becomes closed and non-dependent on external cues. This is in the case of ovulation. And just remember, the first part of the menstrual cycle, it's wards, so to speak, towards ovulation, which happens at mid-cycle. Something similar happens to decidualization. So in a similar way, in the studies of the evolution of menstruation, the hypothesis is that what in the beginning was signaled by the embryo then become a signal from the ovaries, the progesterone that is produced by the ovaries. And this makes the shedding of the endometrium a byproduct of the spontaneous decidualization that will happen cyclically, independently of copulation, independently of fertilization, and also the claim this is a kind of autonomization of the process. And again, to show it in more graphical terms, the external signal, which was enabled at the beginning by the embryo, it's internalized by the endometrial cells, which anticipate implantation and then start self-organizing all the enabling conditions for the civilization, and in which menstruation is just a byproduct. But I think it's more or less obvious that we can see here again another closure. So, though most eutherian mammals ovulate and desexualize, at least in the case of the human menstrual cycle and maybe other menstrual species, ovulation and desexualization, which are the conditions, or at least some necessary conditions to menstruate, are spontaneous. And I argue this allows the cycle to be operationally closed under precarious conditions through internalizing the two external cues as they are integrated into the ovarian cycle. So if so far I succeed in convincing you that the menstrual cycle is an autonomous system, what do we gain by granting autonomy to the menstrual cycle? Well, I think it's very interesting to see the menstrual cycle as an autonomous system because it changed completely the way we approach its interaction with other systems, especially with other autonomous systems like the nervous system. So let's take again the example of the interaction between hormones and the GABA receptor. Instead of focusing on a hormonal level and its effect on the mechanisms of the single receptor, we can try to model or to think in more systemic terms by looking at that as two autonomous systems that interact in complex ways and produce their own patterns, which can work as attractor points to each other. So I think this is a quite new way to approach the topic, and I think it's very promising. That's all for now. Thank you so much for listening, and I will stop sharing the screen. Oh, sorry. This was a complementary slide. Stop sharing.
Great, thank you very much, Alejandra. So there's some sort of really interesting points there. It's, as I've mentioned to you before we sort of came on air, as it were, it's sort of fascinating and somehow continually surprising that phenomena as fundamental as menstruation have seen such relatively little research compared with so many other biological facets, and also the kinds of research that you were describing in the first half of your talk, which is when this research is undertaking, it's usually done in order simply to recapitulate stereotypes. Essentially, it's a question of, well, how can we use our sort of better understanding of the menstrual cycle in order to shore up or otherwise give evidence to the kinds of stereotypes and biases and so on. Yeah, so it's fantastic work to see this opened up and explored in a kind of more novel way, and I think sort of very important work for that. So I'm sort of particularly intrigued. I guess there's kind of a couple of things that are related, and to a large extent my questions are a lot about that last sort of slide of yours, and to look into the sort of the possibilities there. In essence, the notion of organizational closure or autonomy that is sort of developed because of organizational closure is the basis for agency within enactive thinking. And so that evolutionary transformation that you described from externally signaled changes to spontaneous changes would seem to point towards an increase in agency over the course of those evolutionary changes. Would that seem right? Is there sort of something to that, or is an increase in agency the kind of wrong way to think about it?
Wow, that's an excellent question, because one of the issues that I address in the chapter that I didn't mention here is the work of Bernd Roslenbroich, which works on precisely how the main evolutionary transitions, the major transitions in evolution can be seen as an increase in autonomy. And he has a chapter on reproduction. And he puts the example of the evolution of the amnion as internalization of the eggshell to protect the embryonic development, and then the evolution of placenta. And from there, I thought it can be extrapolated to the case of the evolution of the menstrual cycle and the evolution of ovulation. The evolution of ovulation and evolution of menstruation. However, well, there are two issues here. I don't think that by claiming autonomy in the menstrual cycle, we are claiming agency in this case. To me, in particular, I think that agency is something that we grant to the organisms more than to subsystems or suprasystems, right? So it might be said that it's an increase in autonomy, maybe, yeah, that I can agree with that. However, I have some disagreements with the way Roslenbroich uses the idea of autonomy, in particular because he don't use technical definition of operational closure, though he's acknowledged by enactive theories. His use is more like an idea of internalization or independence from the environment, so we become more independent. And that's like that's a partial view, I think, of autonomy. Like, it's very often mistaken, I think, the enactive idea of autonomy as the common idea of autonomy, like independence. I think in many non-enactive circles is the challenge to deliver the message of what autonomy means for cognition in technical terms, which is not necessarily independent. At the contrary, I think it allows more complex interactions by regulating precisely, in the case of the menstrual cycle, it's able to generate strong patterns, dynamic patterns that change over time, that are precarious because they can face perturbations like, I don't know, to get pregnant or breastfeeding or take contraceptives, or you have a stress, so you have an ovulatory cycles, like the process is precarious. But yeah, I think that part of the definition, the technical definition, is quite missing in the idea of increasing autonomy, right? Because we think that we are going into a linear, right? A linear.
Yeah, a sort of upward gradient, just a sort of upward slope of more of whatever it is, more of it. Right?
Exactly, and that can be a little misleading, or not. I don't know. It depends. If we get more precise, maybe not. But yeah, I think you know what I mean.
That I fully appreciate that. That is sort of an important point. I guess there'll be. So what it means is, so I'm just processing it in terms. So rather than think about it in terms of more agency, it's just a transformation of agency. So some will, new possibilities will open up in some ways, and then other possibilities might in fact be closed off in other ways. So it's just thinking about it, the increase of agency is just a sort of a poor phrasing.
Yeah.
So sorry, go.
No, your comment made me think that, for instance, more autonomy in the menstrual cycle, what a question that I have all the time in the thesis is that, okay, but if the menstrual cycle is autonomous, what does that mean for the agency of the person, right? Maybe, I don't know if it's related with your question. And in that sense, I do think that it might seem that the menstrual cycle, the fact that it's autonomous can be overwhelming, deterministic for women, but actually I think it's not necessarily like that, because it has been shown that the more aware you are of your bodily processes, the better you can surf the what your body enables you to do. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but
no, absolutely. I know exactly what you mean there. Which
yeah,
and yeah, no, it's an interesting point. I mean, I guess it's one of those things that you see in some of the descriptions of the evolution of human sexuality and human reproduction in general, is the sort of wider range of options that women have because of concealed ovulation, for example, in comparison with other apes, for example. So,
yeah.
so I mean, there's some interesting possibilities there. I do want to get to another question. Just Laura Mahika has question via excuse me, the YouTube chat here, and I think it leads directly on and also opens up another point that I want to get to. But Laura says, thank you very much for a very interesting talk and very convincing. So thank you very much. Many questions, but here's one. If the menstrual cycle is autonomous and behaves rhythmically without external cues, how is this autonomy affected when there is actually an embryo? Does the autonomous menstrual system disappear in the case of pregnancy?
Yeah, as I said, I think that should take in as a perturbation in which that antibodies adapt to that, because that's expected, right? So if you think about that in the long term, the body allows the pregnancy to happen, but then the menstrual cycle is reestablished. It doesn't mean that your ability to have this spontaneous ovulation and deserialization is extinguished. The ability is not extinguished. It's just temporarily a rest, so to speak, to allow the actual goal to happen, which is reproduction, right? That's why we evolve deserialization and ovulation at the first place, in the first place. So yeah, no, yeah, I wouldn't say that the menstrual cycle disappear. Just
it's another transformation question rather than, so it becomes the pregnancy, and then when the pregnancy completes, it sort of transforms back to it probably doesn't go back to exactly the same state as it did before, of course, as well. It's often transformed as well. Okay, yeah. That's no. So that links a little bit, because you mentioned precariousness there, and I guess there's a question of whether or not. So it is possible that you can have an operationally closed system that is not precarious. And that was one of the big changes that Ezequiel Di Paolo introduced, and that has transformed the way enactive theory has worked over the past 20 years or so, is that autonomy by itself is kind of not sufficient for agency. Now, again, we're kind of back to this, almost to the first question, and so wanting to be careful about when we're talking about autonomy and agency and how they interact. But do you consider there to be precariousness in the autonomous menstrual cycle, or is it a relatively non-precarious autonomous system?
I would say it should be precarious, and is precarious. However, I think that precariousness should be thought more into, should open questions about the open aspects of autonomy, like those aspects that allow the system to be open to external interactions. So it's not absolutely closed, though the definition emphasizes the closure. the idea is not to isolate the system, but the system, as any living being, has to maintain in openness. That's not explicit in the, I think it's not explicit in the technical definition, but when I talk about precariousness, I like to think more on that open aspect of the definition. Not of the definition, but of that's what the theory wants to put forward, I think. Yeah.
It is a kind of one of those odd tensions in that description of autonomy within the enactive approach, that we are operationally closed but materially open, and that there's that kind of odd difference between the formal description of a system and the material instantiation of a system, and so the formal domain is closed, but the material domain is always, as you say, it's always open, it's always sensitive. So yeah, okay. So and in terms of this openness, then I guess now, and I apologize if this is a very male question, but what I'm curious then is the sort of the emphasis that you have put on the essentially the incorporation of the menstrual cycle. So there's an extent to which we could describe, or could we describe, the other forms of processing of the endometrium, I guess, for want of a better word, if it's not a cycle, in externally signaled decidualization and so on, that as the transformation as has occurred in humans, that made it a spontaneous cycle, was almost like the process became incorporated, taken into the body of someone who menstruates, rather than being sort of so open and kind of driven by external factors. And I think that sort of change in perspective, as Lara has pointed out, it makes the rhythm and the sort of period of the menstrual cycle autonomous and kind of endogenous rather than triggered by external cues. So I'm curious then, does that help shift our perspective away from this idea of the month having anything to do with it? In a sense, you're kind of making the point, well, look, the rhythmic aspect of this is entirely just this aspect that is to do with the endogenous dynamics of the system itself, and the fact that it, for some number of people, happens to have something vaguely close to a 4-week cycle is almost coincidental, as it were, that or might there be some aspect of that kind of traditional, for want of a better phrase, 4-week cycle that has some relevance still to understanding the process?
You mean if it determines that the way it's spontaneous, if that determines the length of the cycle? Is that
yeah, I mean, I guess, but that also that will always be determined within a given body. So it's kind of this shift away from this notion of a universal, sort of a standard or an average body. But what it means is we have to get rid of this notion that there is a standard or an average cycle and an average length to that cycle. So,
okay, how this can change that idea? Okay, well, it's very well acknowledged, I think, that the cycle length, even in one individual, changes across the life span. At the beginning, it might be longer, then it becomes stabilized into a certain duration, but it's on average 28 days, but it might be longer, might be shorter. And then, depending if we go through pregnancy or through breastfeeding, and as we get older, it tends to become shorter. The luteal phase in concrete becomes shorter. So it's all the time changing, actually. And yeah, that's something to be studied. And maybe from the autonomous perspective, we can see that, how this dynamic whole change over time. And it could be interesting to model that or to try to model that. It's one of my maybe future projects. Not exactly to determine the length or the normal length, just to see how it changed and to make it more evident that we shouldn't expect or normalize or pathologize different kinds of cycles. So yes, and actually I wanted to comment, maybe relate to another question that it's suggested by this evolutionary biologist that I talked before, that actually it seems that the luteal phase, meaning from ovulation to menstruation, it seems that this is a kind of rehearsal of the pregnancy process. So I don't know, to start thinking in all these new terms instead of I don't know, like a nasty thing to, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Like it's rejected for many reasons, both even by feminists, because it sounds so deterministic to talk about the biological parts of the menstrual cycle, but I think the enactive theory is promising to show a non-essentialistic way to study the topic. Yeah, and to acknowledge the diversity of embodiments precisely of this phenomenon, even if we can claim an abstract property like autonomy, right? But that's can be instantiated in a diverse mirror in many ways. So yeah.
Superb. I think that's a very positive note on which to end, to sort of shift our perspective and to ensure our sensitivity to that diversity and variability in human beings. So I will say, so we're very much coming to the end of time, or our time slot, rather than something massively existential there. So I want to say thank you very much, Alejandra, for a fascinating talk. I think, brilliant and important work. And I was very pleased that you came and shared it with us.
Thank you to you.
So thanks very much, and hopefully we will see others. So this will be it then. This is our final seminar for the current academic year, the 23-24 series. But we're starting to line up speakers already for the 24-25 series. So we will be back in September with another ENSO seminar. So thanks very much, and hopefully we will see you then.
See you soon.